Welcome to Discovering God's Word, chapter by chapter. Hi, I am Elliot Hamm, the minister at the Willette Church of Christ in Red Boiling Springs, Tennessee. I will be your host for this podcast. Thank you for joining me for our study of God's Word. I am so glad you have joined me this week as we continue our study through the book of Mark. This week's study is from Mark chapter 8. This chapter is a critical turning point in the gospel. This remarkable chapter will strengthen one's faith in the one named Jesus, who is proven to be the Christ. The evidence lies in the miracles of feeding and healing, in the confession of Peter, in the prediction of Jesus' death, and the challenge that he left us all. The chapter kicks off with a familiar scene. Jesus miraculously feeds over 4,000 people with a few loaves and fish. This chapter also contains some shocking parts. The disciples had just seen him do this for 5,000 people, and still they totally missed the point. Their hearts were still spiritually dull, focused on the problem of food instead of the identity of the one providing the food. Jesus deals with the Pharisees once again. They're demanding a sign from heaven, and he flat out refuses. This leads to a beautiful and somewhat strange miracle where Jesus heals a blind man in 2 stages. It is a powerful picture of what Jesus is doing in his disciples' lives and in our own. A gradual, step-by-step opening of our eyes to the truth. The chapter culminates in one of the most famous moments in all of the Bible, Peter's bold confession that Jesus is the Christ, and then Jesus' foretelling of his death and resurrection. Let's take a closer look at our text. In verses 1 through 10, we see Jesus feeding the 4,000. As Jesus' reputation continued to spread, a great multitude had been with him for 3 days and had nothing to eat. Moved with compassion, Jesus called his disciples to him, expressing concern that if he sent the people away hungry, they might faint along the long journey home. The disciples, in a moment of spiritual amnesia, responded with a completely human question. How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? This was a stunning reaction, considering they had just witnessed Jesus perform a very similar miracle for 5,000 people. Jesus, however, did not chastise them. He simply asked them how much food they had. They told him 7 loaves. Taking that small supply along with a few fish, Jesus gave thanks, broke the bread, and commanded the people to sit down. He gave the food to his disciples to distribute, and in a divine display of provision, everyone ate until they were completely full. When it was all over, they gathered up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. The number of people who ate was about 4,000, not counting women and children. This astonishing miracle once again proves that Jesus is able to meet the needs of the people in the most impossible of circumstances. In verses 11 through 21, we see the Pharisees are seeking a sign. After miraculously feeding 4,000 people, Jesus and his disciples were confronted by Pharisees. They came out to him, demanding a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority and to test him. Jesus, sighing deeply in his spirit, refused, saying, "Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." He saw their hearts were hardened, and no amount of evidence would change their minds. He then got back in the boat and left them behind. On the journey across the sea, the disciples realized they had forgotten to bring bread. They only had 1 loaf with them. In a moment of high irony, Jesus warns them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." The disciples, still focused on their practical problem, started arguing among themselves, thinking he was talking about their lack of food. Frustrated by their spiritual blindness, Jesus gently rebuked them. He reminded them that their hearts were still hardened and asked a series of powerful rhetorical questions. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? He then walked them through 2 miracles of the loaves, reminding them of the massive leftovers from both of those events. he concluded with a touching question that gets right to the heart of their struggle. How is it that you do not understand? This passage reveals something about those people closest to Jesus, the struggle to fully grasp Jesus' identity and power. In verses 22 through 26, we see the blind man at Bethsaida. Now we find Jesus and his disciples in this area. A blind man was brought to him. This is a very personal act. Jesus took the man by the hand and led him out of the town. He then used a very physical method of healing, spitting on the blind man's eyes and laying his hands on him. When Jesus asked if he could see anything, the man's sight was only partially restored. The man said, "I see men like trees walking." Jesus then laid his hands on the man's eyes a second time, and this time the man's sight was completely restored, so that he could see everything clearly. This two-stage healing is a unique and powerful parable in Mark's Gospel. Just as the man's sight was gradually restored, the disciples' spiritual blindness would also be healed, little by little, as they came to a clearer understanding of who Jesus truly was. Jesus then sent the man home, telling him not to return to the town. In verses 27 through 30, we see Peter confessing Jesus as the Christ. They are now on their way to the area of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus turned to his disciples and asks a question that would truly define their mission. He asks, "Who do men say that I am?" The disciples responded with the popular but a bit muddled opinions of what they had heard. Some thought he was John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But Jesus pressed them with a more personal and pivotal question, saying, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter, speaking for the group, gave the stunning and correct answer: "You are the Christ." This moment marks a profound turning point in the gospel, as Peter finally grasps Jesus' divine identity. However, Jesus sternly commanded them not to tell anyone, as the time for his full revelation had not yet come. This confession of faith, though incomplete in its understanding of his coming suffering, was the first step towards true spiritual sight. In verses 31 through 33, Jesus will foretell of his death and resurrection. As he's beginning to teach his disciples about his true mission, he will plainly reveal that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the religious leaders, and also be killed. But he also included the promise that he would rise again after 3 days. This was a total shocker, and Peter, struggling to reconcile this with his vision of the conquering Messiah, took Jesus aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Jesus' response was immediate and harsh. He turned, looked at the other disciples, and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." This sharp rebuke shows that even a correct confession of faith can be followed by a purely human understanding of God's plan. Peter was focused on earthly power, while Jesus was focused on the divine path of sacrifice. As the chapter comes to a close, we see Jesus teaching about taking up the cross and following him. He has now called the crowd and his disciples together to deliver a challenging message about the true cost of following him. He says, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." This was a call to a life of total self-sacrifice, not to comfort. Jesus then presented a powerful paradox, saying, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." He then underscored the eternal value of a human soul. He asks the question, "For what will it profit if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" The message is clear. Nothing on earth is worth losing your soul for. Jesus ends with a solemn warning that if anyone is ashamed of him and his words, he will also be ashamed of them when he returns in his glory. Mark chapter 8 is a major turning point in this gospel. It's all about getting our spiritual eyes open. The disciples, despite witnessing miracle after miracle, they are still struggling to see Jesus for who he is. We watch Jesus gently but firmly confront their spiritual blindness, teaching them that his mission is not about earthly power, but about suffering and sacrifice. It all culminates in a breathtaking moment where Peter finally gets it right, declaring Jesus as the Christ, only to immediately get it wrong, trying to talk Jesus out of the cross. The chapter forces us to ask ourselves the same question: who do we say Jesus is? And are we willing to take up our cross and follow him, even when the path does not look like what we expect? This is a powerful and unforgettable call to true discipleship. Here are a few applicable lessons from Mark chapter 8. Number 1. Spiritual blindness is a real problem. The disciples, despite witnessing 2 miracles of feeding thousands, still questioned how Jesus could do this. The healing of the blind man in 2 stages serves as a powerful metaphor for their own spiritual journey. It shows that understanding Jesus is not an instant process. It is a gradual opening of our eyes to the truth. Secondly, true discipleship requires self-denial. Jesus teaches that to follow him means that we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. This is a radical call to a life of sacrifice, not one of comfort, certainly not one of earthly successes. Thirdly, correct theology is not enough. Peter made the correct and profound confession, declaring that Jesus is the Christ. But just moments later, his human-centered thinking led him to rebuke Jesus. This teaches us that knowing the right answer is not the same as having a heart and a mind aligned with God's will. Lastly, the value of a soul is immeasurable. Jesus asked that sobering question: for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? This lesson drives home the truth that earthly possessions and worldly success are ultimately meaningless compared to the eternal value of a single soul. Here are a few questions to think about this week from Mark chapter 8. After witnessing 2 similar miracles, why do you think the disciples still questioned how to feed the crowd? What does this reveal about the human tendency to forget past provisions and focus on present problems? Number 2, Jesus told the disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. The disciples were confused, thinking he was talking about bread. What are the leavens in our world? The subtle cultural or spiritual influences that distract us from what Jesus is truly saying. Question 3. Why do you think Jesus healed the blind man in 2 stages? How might this gradual process be a better picture of our own spiritual journey rather than an instant aha moment? Finally, Jesus asked, "What will a man give in exchange for his soul?" What are the things that you are most tempted to exchange for your soul? And what does it look like to guard against those things? Here are a few things to keep in mind regarding Mark chapter 8 this week. Number 1, take up your cross. Identify one area in your life where you're trying to save your life by seeking comfort or maybe control. Intentionally surrender that area to God this week, trusting that by losing it, you will truly find your spiritual life. Number 2, reevaluate your priorities. Take a moment to reflect on your daily activities. Maybe take a moment to reflect on your worldly possessions. Are you giving them too much weight? Choose one thing this week to prioritize the health of your soul over, and see how it goes. Mark chapter 8 is a powerful chapter. The disciples get a much needed wake-up call. as do we. We see Jesus challenge their spiritual blindness, redefine what it means to be the Messiah, and then give a powerful and unforgettable lesson on the true cost of following Him. This chapter forces us to ask, are our eyes open to who Jesus truly is? Are we willing to take up our cross? Friends, thank you so much for listening this week. I pray that you will join me again next week as together we discover God's Word chapter by chapter. Have a great week.